The Dirt with me, Mike Howell, an economics podcast where I present the down and dirty agronomic science to help grow crops and bottom lines. Inspired by economics.com, farming's go-to informational resource, I'm here to break down the latest crop nutrition research, news, and issues, helping farmers make better business decisions through actionable insights. Let's dig in. Well, hello again, everyone, and welcome back to The Dirt. This week, we're broadcasting live from Tampa, Florida. We're here for the Sulphur World Symposium. I'm pleased to have with me this morning two different guests. One you've met before, Dr. Blaylock, Senior Agronomist with Nutrien. Alan, welcome back to The Dirt.
Thanks, Mike. It's good to be with you again.
And our next guest is Ron Olson. Ron is with the Sulfur Institute and is helping to put on this symposium. Ron, if you don't mind, introduce yourself to our guest and tell us a little bit about what you do.
Certainly, Mike. It's great to have you and Alan with us in Tampa this week at the Sulphur World Symposium. This is an annual event for the Sulfur Institute. This year, we have 120 guests attending the conference. Our last time together was 2019 in Prague. So we're delighted to experience the energy everyone has about getting together again and picking up where we left off, but also learning some new things about sulfur and how the world's events are impacting and shaping the sulfur market. It's good to have you here, Mike and Alan.
Thanks, Ron. It's great to be here. If you would, tell us a little bit about the Sulfur Institute and what the purpose of the Sulfur Institute is.
I would be happy to. The Sulfur Institute is 60 years old. It has 60 members across the globe. At this conference, we have members from Kazakhstan, from India, from China, European countries, and Latin American countries. So it's got a global reach. We think of ourselves as the Global Association for Sulfur and Sulfuric Acid Professionals. As the Sulfur Institute, we have members that are in the mining business. They mine sulfur. They're in the marketing business. They're in the business of making fertilizers that have sulfur contained in them. And we also have people that are in the various support service lines in terms of rail car linings and couplings. And sulfur is a difficult product to handle, and you need to handle it with the right equipment and the right types of materials. So those are the members that make up our institute.
Okay, and Ron, if you will, tell us a little bit about the symposium. Why are you hosting the symposium this week?
This is really an important activity for the Sulfur Institute. One of our working groups is our Information and Advocacy Working Group, and they focus on working to have a program that spreads the word about the importance of sulfur in our daily lives and the importance of sulfur to the economy of the globe. So we get together to allow everyone to get caught up on what's new in regulation, what's new in the market strategy, and with the events going on in Ukraine. We have speakers that are going to be talking this week about how the global market is going to be impacted, the economy is going to be impacted. It's a chance to have sulfur experts addressing members who have various questions and needs to be expressed. We have an agronomy steering committee that's meeting this week. This is made up of 11 member companies who are in the business of producing, manufacturing, or marketing sulfur-enhanced fertilizers. And we're so glad to have them here with us in Tampa. This is the first time that this group is meeting face-to-face. We formed the Agronomy Steering Committee in March of 2021. We meet quarterly by the wonderful Teams technology or Zoom technology. It just gives us a chance as sulfur experts. These are all agronomists who've had, I'll say, decades now in agriculture, serving the agriculture community, and they're very much involved in using their company's products to enhance the yield profiles and yield benefits that can come from sulfur in their various retail and other areas. We have a chance for these agronomists to support each other, learn from each other, interact then with the overall membership that comes together here, as I said, on an annual basis to renew and grow from being together and gain some new ideas.
So, Ron, you mentioned that this is an annual event. This is my first time to be able to come to the symposium, but where will the next symposium take place?
Well, we've been asked that question several times already this week, and we rotate. We work to rotate from North America to somewhere in Europe is what's been our tradition. So as I said before, we were in Prague in 2019, so we're going to go back to Europe. What has surfaced just this week is possibly Scotland is going to be the host for our next meeting. We were in Ireland 6 years ago, but Scotland seems to have been raised as a real strong possibility. So stay tuned. That decision is going to be made here in about 6 weeks.
That sounds great. I'll go ahead and start booking my travel plans now. I'm looking forward to that.
Whether we're in Glasgow or whether we're in Edinburgh or wherever we are, it'll be a good event in Scotland.
Okay, Alan, let's talk a little bit about sulfur and what it does for plants. What is the role of sulfur within a plant?
Well, Mike, sulfur is an essential plant nutrient, as many people recognize. It's actually essential to all living organisms. It is the fourth major nutrient after nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and it has been increasing in its importance in agriculture as a fertilizer, and we'll get into that, I'm sure, in our discussion. But sulfur's main role in plants is as a component of some essential amino acids. There are some key amino acids that require sulfur, and sulfur works hand in hand with nitrogen in forming these amino acids and therefore some essential proteins. There have been some recent studies done showing that proper sulfur nutrition can enhance the plant's disease resistance. So it can make the plant more resistant to some various diseases. So that's a critical role that it plays. But we can't lose track of the importance of sulfur in crop quality. I mean, it's not just yield. Certainly sulfur is involved in photosynthesis and a variety of important plant processes, but also a critical role in quality of many crops.
Alan, you mentioned the relationship with nitrogen and sulfur, and I understand that that's really important. In fact, Dr. Hunter Frame was here yesterday and gave a presentation at the symposium and showed some deficiency symptoms where he was looking at sulfur deficiency in that relationship with nitrogen. And he showed what he actually termed a nitrogen-induced sulfur response, where he applied excess nitrogen in some situations, and that showed up as a sulfur deficiency. So if you would, talk a little bit about this relationship and what proportions we need of each one of these nutrients in place.
Yeah, let's talk about that. If one nutrient is applied at higher levels and we don't have enough of another nutrient, we can induce those deficiencies by imbalance. Sulfur and nitrogen are often looked at together in terms of the ratio, the nitrogen-sulfur ratio. And crops vary in the appropriate ratio. For example, some of the oil seeds, particularly canola, that has a really high sulfur requirement, nutritionally will target a ratio of something on the order of 5-to-1 or 7-to-1 nitrogen to sulfur. Whereas in some of our grasses like corn and wheat, that ratio is more around, say, 15-to-1, just as an approximation. So when we're looking at crop nutrition, we can identify this by plant sampling. And when we see deficiencies occur in the field, that may be one thing to look at. Personally, from an experience, we had an example in a nitrogen study we were doing where we found that our higher nitrogen rates, our more efficient nitrogen treatments were causing a sulfur deficiency. And that really wasn't revealed in the total sulfur in the plant, but in the ratio of nitrogen to sulfur. So that's a really interesting interaction that we study in plant nutrition. And because sulfur availability from soils is a bit more difficult to predict maybe than phosphorus or potassium, we often look at that ratio and apply sulfur in some kind of ratio or relationship to the nitrogen and yield potential that we're working with.
Okay, thanks, Alan. We talked a little bit about deficiencies, symptoms, and seeing these deficiencies show up. And one thing we failed to discuss a couple of weeks ago when we talked about nitrogen was nitrogen deficiency symptoms. And I know a lot of people get confused on these deficiency symptoms between nitrogen and sulfur. So if you will, talk a little bit about both of those deficiency symptoms and how somebody can tell the difference in the field or think they can tell the difference in the field.
Yeah, there's an important distinction between nitrogen and sulfur. In some cases, they may look very similar on the plant, but the location on the plant where we see those deficiency symptoms is different. Nitrogen is very mobile in the plant, and so the plant will remobilize nitrogen from older leaves, move it up into the new growth, and so we see nitrogen deficiency symptoms showing up first on the oldest leaves, so generally working from the bottom of the plant up. Where sulfur is, we consider that immobile in the plant. We see those symptoms show up first on the new leaves that are emerging. So when we're looking at these symptoms, and again, they may look similar, but if they're showing up on the newest growth and not on the older growth, then we're going to suspect sulfur first. If they're showing up on the older growth, then we're going to point us towards nitrogen. Now, sometimes sulfur deficiencies can appear similar to other deficiencies. I've seen cases where the sulfur deficiencies I observed looked very much like manganese deficiency. It was only through the actual tissue testing that we were able to differentiate that. It can appear as a very pronounced striping. It can sometimes appear as just yellowing. It can appear as a more broad stripe on the leaves. And in a crop like canola, it's actually a reddening of the leaf. So it takes a lot of practice and study to correctly diagnose nutrient deficiencies from symptoms alone. They can be a clue as to what to look at, but usually it's best if we confirm those through tissue sampling as well.
Great point, Alan. I'm glad you mentioned that. A lot of people think they can tell the difference, and it'll get us a good idea of what's going on and give us a place to start. But to really understand what's going on inside that plant, we've got to do some tissue analysis and get a lab to tell us what's going on inside that plant. Alan, you mentioned that sulfur is not mobile within the plant. What about in the soil? Is it mobile like nitrogen? And can we lose sulfur similar to how we lose nitrogen?
Good question, Mike. And yes, we do consider sulfur to be mobile in the soil. And that's because the primary plant available form of sulfur is sulfate. And sulfate behaves in the soil very much like nitrate. It's not attached to the cation exchange complex, so it can be moved with water. It can be leached out when we have excess water flowing through the profile. If we have saturated soils, sulfate sulfur, like nitrate nitrogen, can convert back to some gaseous forms that can escape. Say you've got a waterlogged soil, it's been saturated for a while, and you smell that kind of rotten egg odor. You dig into the soil, that's still sulfur gases. So yes, sulfate sulfur, being the plant available form in soil, does behave very much like nitrate. Pay attention to the environmental conditions, the soil type, the water status of the soil, the amount of rainfall we're getting, and we want to pay attention to that in terms of sulfur management.
You talked about the sulfate form of sulfur, and I know there's some growers that apply elemental sulfur and let it go through a breakdown process. Talk a little bit about the different sources of sulfur fertilizer and the advantages of using one over the other.
Yeah, we do have some choices in terms of sulfur fertilizers. Most commonly, we apply sulfur as ammonium sulfate. It's readily plant available. It's available from all our retailers. It's a very common fertilizer. It's produced directly, or it may be produced as a byproduct of some industrial processes, but ammonium sulfate is widely available in the marketplace. So it's a very common material, and it does supply that sulfate form, which is immediately plant available. Another option that is used and is a very economical sulfur source is the elemental sulfur that you mentioned. Now, there are certainly some things we need to understand about elemental sulfur, and that is that it's not water soluble, it's not immediately plant available. That elemental sulfur is converted to sulfate in the soil by some specific sulfur bacteria. So they break that down over a period of time, and the elemental sulfur converts to a plant available form. Because that's a biological process, it's obviously dependent on temperature and moisture conditions. And there's another really important fertilizer property that helps determine that rate of conversion, and that's the particle size. So really fine particles will oxidize more quickly. We see on the market now a number of these so-called micronized elemental sulfurs. They're taking a sulfur powder and mixing it into some of their fertilizer typically. The finer the particle size, the faster the oxidation. Coarser particles will take much longer to oxidize. When you're planning on using elemental sulfur fertilizer, take that into account. Consider the oxidation time, and you may want to apply it further in advance of crop need, maybe in the fall of the previous year, to give it time to start oxidizing. Now, one important thing to consider that can be a benefit of elemental sulfur is that it's considered a slow release sulfur source. So it releases that sulfur to the crop over time. That helps prevent loss of that sulfur by leaching. We talked about potential loss of sulfate sulfur by leaching. The elemental sulfur would help reduce that. It's just a matter of synchronizing the availability of those different sources with plant need.
Okay, great, Alan. Thanks for going through that with us. One other thing I think we ought to talk about this morning, and maybe should have brought this up earlier in the program, is why we're using so much sulfur fertilizer these days. 30 years ago, we didn't use a whole lot of sulfur fertilizer, and the Clean Air Act kind of changed all of that. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, Mike, this is real important because we're now seeing fairly widespread sulfur deficiencies in places where we haven't seen them historically. In the past, previous decades, prior to the Clean Air Act, there was quite a bit of sulfur emitted from factories, particularly coal burning factories or power plants. Coal contains sulfur, so as you burn it, that sulfur can escape into the atmosphere with the emissions. The Clean Air Act put into place requirements to clean that sulfur out of the emissions to prevent that sulfur going into the atmosphere and then being subsequently deposited to the earth as acid rain. So as we've cleaned up our emissions, and that's a good thing. The Clean Air Act has done some great things for our environment and our air quality, but the consequence of that is that we have very little sulfur in most areas being deposited from the atmosphere. It's not coming back to the earth. And so over time, what that has resulted in is less sulfur being supplied by that source to crops. Soils therefore becoming depleted, and particularly as yields have increased over time, we see more widespread need for sulfur application. We have to get that sulfur to the crop in some way. It's not coming from those atmospheric emissions or atmospheric deposition. We now have to apply that as fertilizer. And again, we're seeing that need over many areas where historically it wasn't needed. So it's important to pay attention to that. And that has translated to significant increases in demand for sulfur fertilizers.
And Alan, we have several articles talking about this on our economics website. That's www.nutrien-economics.com. We actually have some time-lapse photographs there of the U.S. BAP and shows how these sulfur depositions are actually decreasing over time with the Clean Air Act. Gentlemen, I want to thank you for joining us today. Is there anything that either of you feel that we haven't talked about today that we need to discuss before we move on?
And I just want to congratulate Nutrien on the effort that you're putting forward with these regular podcasts. I think they are filling a really important need to let certified crop advisors and other interested industry participants get really firsthand updates from you guys in the field. And it's great to know that you're doing this.
Ron, we appreciate your support.
Mike, just again to reemphasize the importance of sulfur in crop nutrition. And, you know, in the past, you go back to some of the old textbooks, and sulfur was considered a secondary nutrient. That's how it was classified, as a secondary nutrient. But we really consider it as a major nutrient. It's one of the macronutrients. It's equally as important as any other nutrient. And especially today, as we see, as I said, higher and higher crop yields, more efficient management of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and other nutrients, we see that increasing need for sulfur. And it is important to food quality. And we think about protein quality in wheat and its baking properties. Well, sulfur plays a role in that. Better quality bread, better quality flours with proper sulfur nutrition. I mentioned the disease resistance from proper sulfur nutrition. So this really is an important nutrient that maybe a few decades ago we didn't talk about nearly as much and has probably been neglected. And now it really has come to the fore in many of our cropping systems as really being critical to good crop performance and good food quality.
Gentlemen, I want to thank you both for joining us today, taking time out of your busy schedule here at the symposium to talk about sulfur and educate people more about the need for sulfur in crop production. Listeners, thank you for joining us this week. If you enjoy our programs, please leave us some feedback, some recommendations for things that you would want to hear on our upcoming programs. And I want to invite everyone to tune in next week as we talk with Dr. John Havlin from North Carolina State University about the importance of calcium and how to get calcium into plants effectively. Until next time, this has been Mike Howell with The Dirt.